Like she said, my name is Jack Smiles. Can y'all hear me back there? I'm from Wyoming Borough, and up till 2 years ago I was a writer for a local paper down there in Pittston. Did a lot of sports, a lot of history writing, and in that 20 years I was there I also wrote 3 books that are historical, well, they're biographies of baseball players from down in the valley in Luzerne County that started out as coal miners. They all quit school to become coal miners, and they all wound up in the Baseball Hall of Fame. It was Hugh Jennings, Ed Walsh, and Bucky Harris. All of them grew up within a 10-mile radius of each other, all coal miners, all in the Hall of Fame. So with that sort of history background, after I didn't work at the newspaper anymore, about 2 years ago I started looking for a niche. I found anniversaries was a good one. I wrote anniversary stories about the last Scranton Miners baseball team for when it was 60 years of that. Then for the last Wilkes-Barre Barons baseball team, the next year, 60 years of that. I wrote a story for the Elmira newspaper about a pennant race of 1914 between Elmira and Wilkes-Barre in the New York Penn League, and that was 100 years. That appeared in 2014. So when I got wind of the Nicholson Bridge having its 100th anniversary, which was last year, it opened in November of 1915, so last November was the 100th anniversary of it. I got wind of that and I thought, well, there's an anniversary story I could write maybe for the Scranton Times. And I began to research it, and through newspapers.com I was able to look at old Scranton Republican papers, Wilkes-Barre Times, Pittston, some Montrose Democrat, even some magazines, and I found, I was astonished by how much I found. I downloaded over 100 PDFs of newspaper and magazine stories about the bridge just from the time that it was being built, from 1912 up until it opened in 1915. So in a 3-year period I found over 100 PDFs, or downloaded over 100, and that was only sort of the tip of the iceberg, you might say. So from that, I had plenty of material for a newspaper article. I went up to Nicholson. I met with a woman who was the head of the Nicholson Heritage Society. Her name's Marion Sweet, a well-named woman, very nice lady. And I was showing her some of the research I had come up with, and we met at the Overlook where you can look at the bridge. And she was astounded. She said, you know, I'm one of the experts and I didn't know half of what you've got here. I never heard of it. So that's when I got the idea that maybe I could put together a little book. Excuse me. I didn't have much time. I wanted to get the book for the Bridge Days. For the every year they have one day in September where they celebrate the bridge. But last year, being the 100th anniversary, they made it a full weekend. They had 3 days. They had a couple hundred street vendors. They had a parade, music on the street, and food trucks, and tables set up for vendors. So I had the idea I would get a table there, get a book together, and take it up there. And then I did it. I pulled it off. PDQ printed it for me. I wrote it on my MacBook. And this, I don't know how well you can see it, but it's actually a newspaper ad that was from the New York Herald when this bridge opened in November of 1915. The railroad, DL&W, which built it, placed this ad in the New York Herald announcing that the road to Anthracite was open. And it was called the 9th wonder of the world, 9th man-made wonder of the world. That's how spectacular it was for the time. So, before the bridge could be built, the precursor to it was something called the Jersey Cutoff. The DL&W, they wanted their ultimate goal was to get a straight line, as straight as they could, from Hoboken to the Great Lakes, to Buffalo. Well, across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, to us, it doesn't seem like the hills and mountains are that great, especially in New Jersey, but for a railroad, that's hell. They're going up and down, and they're going in curves around mountains, and they wanted to get a straight line, as straight as they could. So they built what they called a cutoff, which was across the roof of New Jersey, as one writer put it. And they did it by literally blowing apart mountains, blowing apart hills, filling in valleys, making a road. They reduced the grade to 1%. I have some stats here on that. The New Jersey line was full of long curves and steep hills, the vein of railroads, as I said. They literally tore down valleys, down hills, and filled valleys. The completed double-track cutoff was 28.5 miles long from Water Gap to Hopticon, Lake Hopticon. Cost 10 to 11 million. This is in 1908. It's probably close to $1 billion now. It reduced the curvature 1,500 degrees and the rise and fall from 248 to 11 feet. The descent never exceeded greater than 29 feet to the mile, or 6%. The cutoff shortened the distance from Port Morris to Slateville by 11 miles. It also included a bridge across the Delaware at Paulin's Kill. So once they did that, they wanted to do something similar in Pennsylvania and continue that line so that it could be almost straight without going up and down all these hills, around all these curves, up to Buffalo. They wanted to be the first railroad, the fastest, the DLW did, wanted to be the fastest railroad to get to Buffalo, get to the Great Lakes. And wait a second. So the new cutoff, the cutoff that was here, they called it to the Clark Summit to Halstead cutoff, and they spent $12 million on that, and it's 36.9 miles, and it trimmed only 3 6/10 miles of distance, and everybody thought they were crazy. They're spending $12 million in 1912 money to cut 3 miles of distance, but the idea was to cut the hills and the curves so they had a straight line. To give an idea of what they were trying to do, the old line was Route 11. Once they built this thing, the old rail line became Route 11. So if you drive up 11, imagine you're on a train pulling 50 coal cars on that road and around the curves and up and down the hills. If you've ever reached Nicholson on 11, you know there's a hill going down into Nicholson. It doesn't seem steep when you're in your car, but imagine trying to pull a train up and out of that. They couldn't. They had to get pushers to get the trains up and out of until they built this cutoff. So the central bit of the cutoff was the bridge. They had to get across the Tunkhannock Viaduct, or the Tunkhannock Creek, there at Nicholson. And so they designed this huge, gigantic bridge, which at the time, like I said, was considered the ninth wonder of the world, and it was worthy of that. Excuse me. I have some stats here on our bridge too, the Nicholson Bridge. The engineering magazine, that's the thing, it was so popular all over the world. Japanese architects came here to see it. I found the newspaper stories I referred to earlier. I found one that was in Hawaii, a story about this bridge, and all over the world. And it was this, as you can see here, it was the largest by far steel reinforced concrete structure, even the largest regular concrete structure. The first one to use reinforced steel, where they put rebar, steel rebar down and then poured the cement over the rebar. So the engineering magazine from New York City came out with the specs for the bridge just before they started working on it. 2,230 feet long, about a half mile. 10 180-foot reinforced concrete arches or piers, built in 2 ribs, and 2 more piers buried in the hillsides on either side of the valley. Each rib was 14 feet wide, 8 feet deep, separated by 16 feet. The magazine estimated 164,000 cubic yards of cement and 1,140 tons of reinforced steel would be used. The foundations were to go into bedrock 40 to 60 feet below the ground, requiring excavation of 43,500 cubic yards of earth and rock. Now, when they did the middle pier, if I can get to this. You see, that first picture didn't give you the scope of the size of it. This does that much better. You can see how small those people look there. And you can see there's 2 things buried in the hillsides, one here and one on that side. And that's the finished product then. We go back to this one. So the height of the bridge, oops, I lost my file. There it is. The height of the bridge was, a completed bridge was 240 feet from the top to the lowest point of the creek, and the parapet to enclose the wall on the top of it is, I'll show you a photo of that later, 3 feet thick, 4 feet high. The deck was 34 feet to have it double tracked. That was a big deal, the double tracking, because the previous line had only been one. They had to do all kind of switching. This reduced switching. They could have trains going both ways. I was going to say the center pier, like these piers went 40 to 60 feet into the ground to hit bedrock. But when they tried to dig the center pier to bedrock, they hit quicksand. And it was a good 60 feet of quicksand. And when they exposed it, because this was done in the wintertime, it froze. So they had to wait until the spring, and they had to get some what they called sand hogs, which were special workers from New York City who worked in subways and stuff. They knew how to do this, and they got pneumatic pressure, and somehow with this pneumatic pressure, shoved that quicksand to the side, and we're able to go down, get these sand hogs to go down and finish digging down to the bedrock. So that middle pier goes down something like 90 feet to reach bedrock through the quicksand. Let's see. There was I was wondering when I first started working on this book, were there other books about Nicholson and about the bridge? Official name Tunkhannock Viaduct, and the people in Nicholson call it Nicholson Bridge, and they get mad if you say Tunkhannock Viaduct. And they want to get it officially changed. I don't know if they could do that, but there was other books about it, technical aspects of it, what it was, statistics and technical aspects of how it was built. But there was nothing that really told the story of what it was like in that little town while the bridge was going up. And that's one of the things I've tried to do with this book. And this little town goes from a population of 600 to 2,300 in a matter of months. The railroad built bunkhouses. Just about every homeowner in that town turned their home into a boarding house. When that wasn't enough, the workers, and the influx of workers came, a lot of them came from Europe, and they just made their own shacks right along the trail, right along the tracks, if they had to sleep. There was one house there that they called the House of 9 Beds. Not because it had 9 beds, but it had 27 men slept in these 3 beds in shifts, and they called it the House of 9 Beds. So you can imagine now these guys were paid. I have a little. At a time when the annual salary for an American worker was $670 a year, that's 101 years ago. The The unskilled laborers on the cutoff could make 30 cents an hour to make $700 to $900 a year. Skilled laborers could pull down 1,000. There was a demand for structural steel and reinforced concrete. Draftsmen, electrical engineers could earn $250 a month, $3,000 a year. Crew foremen might make $1,500. The most interesting job was, you can see, if you see those little black spots atop of that, on the top there, and you see that tower back there. Well, that was a technique that was used at the Panama Canal, the same exact technique. It's called the Lidger wood, where they had the cable tower. They had a cable tower on either end of that, and cables strung across the tower, and clamshell buckets on that. And there was steeplejacks also they brought from New York City who rode on those things. And so they could open the clamshells as they brought equipment through that way, and they poured concrete that way. You can imagine guys up 300 feet riding on a clamshell bucket all day long, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week for $1 an hour, which was considered a bloody fortune at the time, because I figured that, and they did work in the winter. They didn't do a lot of work, but they had ways of working in the winter. They had ways of heating the forms so they could pour, and only the worst weather would stop them. But I figured that a guy, a steeplejack they called him, riding on these clamshell buckets made $1 an hour. That's about $25 an hour today, or 30 maybe. They work at 6-hour days, 12 hours a day, no overtime. But I figured for 52 weeks, that would be $3,750, and it would have to be more than Babe Ruth made in 1915. So you can imagine all these young men, most of them 20-somethings. Some of them had families, most of them didn't. They're young guys, away from home. They're all living together, and what do you think they did with their money? They had nothing else to do in this little town. All the bars were filled. They did a lot of drinking and fighting. And one of the chapters in there is called Murder and Mayhem. And it tells a story about a lot of the accidents that happened in building the bridge and people died. But it also tells about some of the fights these guys got into. I'll just read one passage here. Just before Christmas in 1912, men sleeping in a bunk room at Nicholson were startled awake by gunfire and saw flashes as Mel Bozard and Stephen Rock stood a few feet apart from each other, emptying their revolvers at each other. The pair, friends from Austria, killed each other after a night of heavy drinking in an argument over which one was the better worker. And there was another one. This was in the winter of 1914, and Andrew Pamumzio, he was thrown out of a workman's shack and into the cold by a Paola Marion, went back in the shack, put a revolver to Marion's head and killed him as he slept. Then he went to the next shack and confessed. There's a couple other stories like that in here. And again, similar to Panama Canal, which was going on at the same time, only a lot smaller scale, obviously. But they didn't build more than just a bridge. They had to build bunkhouses. They built a small hospital. They built a railroad. They called it a dinky railroad with small engines that brought supplies and everything across the Tunkrannock Creek. They built a temporary bridge there on the old line to bring back and forth the materials that they needed to build the bridge. Another interesting note here was the Nicholson Examiner, which it was a newspaper. It was hard to find. I really couldn't find any Nicholson Examiner copies anywhere, at least not from 1915. But I found, references to Nicholson Examiner stories in like Scranton papers and stuff that I researched. And one story reminded me a lot of what's going on now with shale gas and fracking, in that this influx of workers from out of the area came into Nicholson and were being paid high. Therefore, the landlords and stuff raised rents knowing that these guys had money, which sort of started pricing the regular folks out, which is kind of what happened up in the fracking region there. So there was a parallel there that was interesting. Now, the two people, every time I say, oh, I'm working on a book on Nicholson, or I know something about Nicholson, they always ask me the same question. This woman asked me, so did Dale here, right? Well, is there really someone buried in the pier? It's a myth, obviously, but there's a reason why that myth was perpetrated. For however it got started, I'm not sure, but there was a lot of people believed that a worker fell in there and they couldn't get him out, so he just kept pouring. But the fact is, because, like we said, we had to reinforce these piers have reinforced steel, so if you fell, you'd fall onto a grid. You wouldn't be able to really tumble down. So it really was impossible. But there was a writer for the Scranton paper. Well, actually, there was a writer by the name of Norman Mockridge. He was pretty well-known syndicated newspaper writer. He was syndicated all over the country, although he worked for the New York City World Telegram. This was in the 60s. Excuse me. He died in 2004, Mockridge did, and his obituary described him as a jack of all trades, New York newspaper man, humorist, and columnist. His columns, they said, he wrote about everything from murder to malapropisms. Well, he wrote a story about a concrete laborer being entombed in the giant bridge, and he heard this story and he figured that was perfect fodder for his quirky column. So he wrote about a friend. All this was made up, but he wrote about a friend from Clark Summit, Pennsylvania, by the name of Matthew Garofalo. Mockridge described Garofalo as having an encyclopedic knowledge of Italian opera, Italian art, history, and the quirks and foibles of the Italian character. It was Garofalo who related the story of Librio Coniglio in Scranton Tribune column called Moonbeams and Nightcaps. Mockridge picked it up for his nationally syndicated column. Garofalo wrote that he entertained an Italian judge who was visiting Scranton. From Scranton, the judge went to Buffalo. He wrote that along the way, the judge placed a wreath at the base of the second arch of the Nicholson Bridge in tribute to his boyhood companion, Librio Coniglio, whose body was encased within the concrete. He was said to be a laborer employed by the railroad and an amateur dancing master, and in demonstrating dance steps to his fellow workers, he fell into the concrete mixer at the precise moment it poured the material into the forms. Well, it sounds crazy, and it was. It was written as a spoof, and Mockridge even called it a massive and mad report. Nonetheless, a lot of people didn't get the joke, and the myth persisted. Even as late as 1984, a columnist in the Allentown Morning Call wrote a column called "Workman's Burial Was in Concrete," and this was not with tongue-in-cheek. He really thought it was a true story. So as late as 1984, people were still writing about this and believing that it happened. This columnist from the Allentown paper went up to Nicholson and they said, "We have seen this marker. We have never seen this marker, although we have looked for it." There's supposedly a marker at the site where he fell. "We have never seen this marker, although we looked for it. But local residents, however, assure us of the veracity of this account." So the people up there were having fun with this guy, telling him, yeah, that it was true, and he had written this column. But in addition to the guys killing each other in fights and stuff, there was something like at least 39 people, 39 workers that died building the bridge. That Marion Sweet I mentioned earlier has 39 death certificates that she found. And she and I matched up the death certificates with stories that I found. And in cases I had stories of men who died that she didn't have death certificates for. And the other way around, too. Just to give you one example, Here's one example. 2 men were killed and 17 others cutoff employees were injured in October of 14 when part of the Binghamton to Scranton train rolled down a 30-foot incline into Martins Creek, where the cutoff leaves the old line. The dead were described as 2 tramps stealing a ride. There was another very sad tale about where is that one? He was a young man. He was, I can't find it right now, but he was, I believe, all the way from Berwick, coming up here to work. He went home for Thanksgiving, had Thanksgiving dinner with his family, came back. First day back, falls off of there and gets killed. So there was a lot of that. Guys getting hit by trains. I mean, just walking on the track in this direction and not, when there's a train coming this way, not being able to hear the one behind you. That happened a few times. And let's see if I can find another accident here. Well, there was at least one suicide attributed to this, which was very odd, a very strange happening that one of the engineers, one of the supervisors of the work, was staying in a hotel in Scranton, and he wound up shooting himself. And there's a vivid description of that from the newspaper in the book, a vivid description of how he was discovered. And there was a case of a guy who died of alcohol poisoning, and some from natural causes, of course. And there was so much drinking going on that as the bridge neared completion, the Nicholson residents were glad to get rid of the construction workers, and the din and the dirt. The trade-off was less money, of course. The commissaries, the dry goods stores, postcard stores, souvenir shops, saloons gradually went out of business, a lot of them. But there was a good and bad for the Nicholsonites who were, like I said, kind of sick of having so many people around drinking. And in fact, they went to the polls in 1914 and voted to go dry. The voters of the town voted to go dry. They didn't really have the power to do that, but the court, in those days there was no LCB, the county court handled liquor licenses, and the county court went along with it, and when there was 42 applications for liquor licenses in Wyoming County, and the judge denied them all. So the whole county went dry. So 2 weeks later, a writer with the Scranton Republican visited Nicholson to report on the lack of liquor. He wrote, "Nicholson natives and hundreds of cut-off employees have been, according to law, without anything stronger than milk and water." Of course, it didn't go dry. As he wrote, "Husker wagons, carryalls, auto buses, jitney buses came into town, their springs sunk to the axles with mysterious cargoes." There were speakeasies there where illegal booze was sold. And of course, they can get the train into Scranton anytime they want it. And he described the train coming back from Scranton. Those late cars o' nights are overloaded with visitors, themselves overloaded returning from the city. And then Nicholson stayed dry until after Prohibition. That was in 1933. As it came to the end, they had when the Jersey cutoff was finished, the Society of Engineers was mad at the railroad for not having a ceremony to open the Jersey cutoff. So they had a big ceremony to open the bridge. They had, all kind of dignitaries and politicians came, and they had a ribbon cutting, and they had if you ever heard the saying, there's a girl in a white dress, and she says, "From morn to night on the road of anthracite, my dress stays white from morn to night on the road to anthracite," saying how clean burning the coal was. This woman in a white dress. Her name was Phoebe Snow, which was a made-up name, She was just a character to help promote the railroad, and it was also the name of a train. So there's Phoebe Snow, and they had her and they had another girl in red, and they crashed champagne bottles on the bridge to christen it when it was finished. Let me go quickly through these pictures.
There's a girl in red is what advertising
that shows, you know, that could be any time. It looks like it's probably in the anywhere from the 20s to the 50s, and you'll see a picture that my wife here took. Doesn't look so much different now. That someone there told me a story about their son. Was it your son? That climbed through the. You can see those notches in there. That was those little notches up there. It became kind of a rite of passage for the teenagers around this area, especially up in Nicholson. You couldn't be a man until you walked through that. Each one of those is a little door. You can walk all the way through the bridge that way. And when we were at our table in Nicholson that day selling the books, we talked to several people who did that and whose children had done that. But one quick thing I forgot to say. In addition to the newspaper story in this book, the Good Times magazine wanted a story about what it's like now to live there. So we went up there and we went into a little bar called The Office and talked to some people in there. Met some people who photographed the bridge all the time. A couple who had descendants or ancestors who worked on it. And we went into one of these homes under the bridge, like that one. That's a good shot of those things I was telling you that the kids crawled through. That's the parapet, that's the top of it. You can see how it's crumbling there. That's the same view now that we saw before with that field in front of it. That's a view on the other side too, other side of Nicholson. That's the Tunkhannock Creek. And that's just to go over that little creek is all the trouble they went through. So we visited, I think it was this house, knocked on her door for a story, said, what it's like to live under here. And she said, whenever a train goes by, they still have trains on it. Last I heard, there's like 8 a day. She said she could hear the cement falling through the trees in her backyard like hail. It was crumbling so bad. But the bridge itself is totally sound. What's crumbling is the facade. And the railroad won't fix it. They only fixed it over, you can see where they patched that. They only try to fix it over the road or over the homes. That middle part that's over nothing, they just let it crumble. I may have missed some things, but I'll conclude. There was a writer.
Almost a bridge. Still a railroad that owns it?
Yeah, it's a railroad bridge.
Just, like what company?
Pardon me?
I said, what railroad company owns it?
Now?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question because there's the Norfolk and Southern and oh gee, what was that other one? But pardon me? Yeah, Canadian Pacific and Norfolk and Southern. Norfolk and Southern tried to buy out Canadian Pacific, and it never happened. It's sort of like a legal entanglement there. But one or both of those two own it now. Which reminds me, during those bridge days, you probably know about this, they planned excursions to go during bridge days from Steamtown up and over that bridge and back. They sold 1,500 tickets, and 2 weeks before the bridge days, the railroad demanded $50 million in insurance to let them run these trains, and they didn't have it. So they had to refund, I think, oh guys, $50,000 or more. They had to refund to the ticket holders, and they didn't run those excursions, which kind of spoiled the. It didn't really spoil the bridge days, but it did keep down the crowd a little bit. And then one other thing, there was a companion bridge to this, and it was called Martin's Creek Viaduct, which was up on the cutoff a little further. A much smaller version of the same thing, but still pretty tall. And they had held a dance on top of that Martin's Creek Viaduct during the construction. They had a band from New York City, Oppenheimer's orchestra came, and they built a elevator cage to take the dancers and musicians up on the top of during the Nicholson Bridge days, they had floats, and one of the floats depicted that dance on top of the Martins Creek Viaduct. No, there's one more thing before I guess I could go on and on, but there was a train oh, here. Excuse me, sorry. Well, I probably could remember most of it. From when, as it was during construction, the American Society of Civil Engineers had a convention in New York City, and they all wanted to see this. So the DLW put together a train for them, special train to take them up to the bridge, and it was said to be the most luxurious train ever run. It was said to be the heaviest at over 1 million pounds. It was only the second train ever to have a wireless radio on it, so the correspondents on the train could send their stories back to New York. And that was one special visit there, and there was others. Like they said, Edison was there. Anybody familiar with the writer Theodore Dreiser, who's famous for a book called American Tragedy? He was a famous writer. He was there. He wrote some things about it. And maybe I should conclude with that. Dreiser, okay. Sorry about this. I can't find it right now, but Dreiser wrote about the bridge, and then at the end, the Scranton writer wrote about the what it was going to be like when it was all over with. And here's what he wrote. With the great arches nearly completed over 2 spans at each of the great viaduct, the magnitude of the work shows boldly. Over it all hangs an air of mystery, creating a feeling akin to a wave in the breast of the visitor. With the passing of this emotion, there comes a great admiration and respect for this engineering feat that so rightly takes its place as one of the wonders of the world. So, is any questions?
How long did it take to complete the bridge?
It was 2.5 years. They started in the middle, in like June of 12, and they finished in November of 15.
I've heard either this bridge or the one right down the street from it as referred to by a number. I don't know if this was number 7. You might know that.
No, I don't recall coming. I don't recall coming across that.
I was wondering if there were like 7 viaducts from Hoboken to here.
That's a good chance of it. I don't recall coming across that though. There was other viaducts.
Nicholson.
Yeah, that's possible. There was other viaducts, much smaller, of course, but yeah. Anybody else?
You mentioned that one of the purposes was to reduce the time to Buffalo. How much did it actually cut down on the time?
Yeah, that's good. I forgot to mention that. Freight trains were taken, when it first opened, freight trains were getting there 20 minutes sooner, passenger trains maybe an hour, and as time passed and they had better engines and they learned how to transverse the route. Once they got some experience, they cut it down even further, and they cut it down to something like 2 hours. 2 hours less than it had been. But then, you know, to railroads, time is money, so it was a big deal.
Some trivia. You mentioned Matthew Garofalo with the body. It's ironic. His shop was directly across the street here. Maybe some of the ladies have heard of Matthew and Nicholas. No, beauty salon, right there. That's Matthew.
So he was,
Hairdresser.
yeah, he must have been sound like quite a character. According to, he went along with that whole prank there. Anybody else?
Did they ever complete the train from, to go straight to Buffalo?
Oh yeah.
Did they ever complete it?
Oh yeah. So the Jersey cutoff and this cutoff that included this bridge were the, I mean, they always had a train to go to Buffalo. It just was so hard to get there and it took so long.
So from New Jersey, it went all the way to Buffalo?
From Hoboken to Buffalo, and that was the whole goal of the building of the two cutoffs.
I missed it. What was the length, point to point, the length of
The bridge, by I'm close to a half a mile, 2,300 feet, I think it was. So it's close to a half a mile, yeah. And how many of you, if you haven't seen it, you should go up there. It's awe-inspiring, it really is. Yeah. Anybody else?
One of the seaman boys flew his Piper Cub under one of the arches.
That was my grandfather,
Oh yeah?
See that?
Dick Seaman.
He was one of the what?
Talking about Dick Seaman.
Same clan.
Richard, yeah, was my grandfather.
Yeah.
And what was his job again?
He was a pilot. He was
They had
flew
flying
under-
tigers.
He actually did.
Oh.
He did a loop under the arches. But he,
And that's, so you mentioned that Lindbergh was there, he flew over it.
yeah, this was under it.
Yeah.
Before the
Under
trees
the
had grown
arch,
up.
yeah.
Anybody else?
And my mother used to play in the arches. She grew up in Nicholson.
She grew up in the, like they said,
I lived there the first few years of my life.
yeah, so you're familiar with
But
it.
there were like small rooms, she said, in the pillars, almost, she said, not really considered a room, but she said the boys would play cards in there. And they would also challenge each other to run and jump across the gap between those two, the gap
Yeah.
between that picture, which is pretty substantial. No one ever fell that she knew of, but
Yeah,
these
the-
boys would run and jump across it.
Yeah, amazingly, there was no accidents that's known of with the kids climbing around through there.
How about suicide?
Do you have any idea when those houses were built?
Oh,
I was wondering why they were built so close to the bridge.
well, some of these houses were there first.
And then tell me.
Some of them houses were there first, or they're over 100 years old. Why someone would build that close, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. But this one, the woman that lived in the one house I told you about, that the crumbling facade falls through her trees. The woman across the street said, "Oh, you know, my kids swore they had never climbed on that bridge when they were growing up, and then when they were adults, they all confessed to me that they had done it." Anybody else? Question?
Did you ever climb it?
No, we. There is a way to drive up there. You can take your car up pretty close to it and walk the rest of the way. And, but there, when it was first opened, it was just constant traffic. There would be 20 passenger trains a day, 20 or 30, and another 50 freight cars, mainly taking coal, up to the Great Lakes to get shipped out to the Midwest by barge. And then now, the last I heard, which was back in November, was down to eight a day. But it is still in use.
Is that house still there?
Pardon me?
The house that is depicted here, is it still there?
I'm not sure if it's the exact house. Can you remember?
It's still there.
That's still there.
Yeah, that's the one where the lady was talking about the, yeah. Yeah, that's where you took that picture. This is a recent picture, yes. We visited that lady and the one across the street.
Did you ever take the train up?
No, I didn't. That was canceled, you know, last November. Previous to that, the last excursion had been, oh God, I think it had been like 10, 15 years before that.
Yeah, they did have one.
Yeah, they were doing them regularly for a while, then they stopped. Then they were going to do it again for the event, and it just, like I said, the insurance nixed that idea. Anybody else? Yeah.
You know what, the holiday train that goes over there at Christmas time, is that Canadian?
Yeah.
I think it's Canadian Pacific that runs it, it's all lit up and they stop on the bridge for people.
Yeah, I don't think they did that this year either. I don't know. No.
Train didn't even come here.
Yeah. No. That was an annual event for a while there, and then that stopped too. I guess the entanglement of the railroad ownership and the insurance problems there are stopping all those excursions.
They have regular, I guess it would be freight traffic.
Yeah.
It's a big difference on having a passenger train. Or
Yeah.
is that so much difference?
Right. The freight, like I said, I think the last I heard it was 8 a day. And I think the one track is out. It's down to one track now. They tore the one track out. Anybody else? All right, thanks.